All right. What up, friends? We will go ahead and get started. Knock out all the logistical stuff while people continue to roll in. So, if you are new to Clinical Athlete or the CALU community, or this is your first journal club, welcome, and new to the Level Up initiative. As many of you know, Clinical Athlete and Level Up are joining forces, have joined forces, and one of the first orders of business was creating a free community for you guys, networking and brain gains galore. And you're probably familiar with it already, but if you're not, you should join the CALU community Facebook group so that you never miss anything. Awesome discussions going down there every day. I just dropped a link into the chat. So if you're not already a member of that free group, do that. And as far as participating in this particular meeting, you've got a few options. You can type the word question or comment in the chat. If you want to unmute yourself and ask, we'll see that as a cue for us, and we'll just tell you to unmute yourself. Sometimes people don't want to interrupt the chat, but if you like Megan just dropped it in the chat. If you type question or comment, we'll know that you got something to say. You could also just type that word and then your question or your comment just so we can see it, because sometimes the chat gets going and then things get buried. Or you can just be an active listener and soak up the conversation that way. We will do breakout rooms so that we can make the conversations even more in depth. And these meetings are open to everyone who wants to join, and we do record these. We will send them out in the next couple of days. We'll drop it in the CALU Facebook group. So if you've got colleagues and friends that would get something out of these journal clubs, tell them about it. I'm also going to put the link to the paper in the chat. That's the link straight to the PDF. So if you didn't get a chance to download the paper, there it is for you. And then one more quick note on sound. If you were unmuted and join the conversation, but then later you're not talking, just try to remember to mute yourself so your background info doesn't come through. Otherwise, just use the chat as however you see fit. Side discussions, trolling, live videos of your max effort Jefferson curl as we talk about lumbar spine loading here. With all of that said, welcome to the CALU Journal Club meeting number 7. My name is Quinn Hennick, and I am joined by Kevin McNamara, who's a physical therapist in the Seattle area and the one originally responsible for bringing these journal clubs to life. So thanks for being here as always, Kevin.
Yeah, sure thing, Quinn. I'll tell you what, man, I'm looking pasty up here in the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, man.
Sun, man.
You got a couple months and then it'll be sunny for like 8 weeks. And then I did one of my rotations was in Puyallup, Washington, just south of Seattle. And it was in like June, July, August. So it was beautiful. It was like perfect. But I was like, you're not fooling me. I know if I stay here any longer.
Quinn drop off.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see if he hops on here. Anyways, guys, so today's paper, we kind of were talking about loaded lumbar spinal flexion. So we had a paper, I'll pull it up here real quick. Title of the paper today was Getting Out of Neutral, the Risks and Rewards of Lumbar Spine Flexion During Lifting Exercises. Recently published. This was from Strength and Conditioning in March 2021. The lead article here was Lewis Howell, and then secondary author here was Greg Lehman, as I'm sure most of us are familiar with. Big voice in the rehab setting. And essentially what they did is they kind of took an overview, like a walkthrough of the history with regard to just general lumbar spine mechanics, and how this idea of assumption of a neutral posture during lifting is supposed to be described as something that is ideally less injurious, so to speak, when we're talking about bilateral lifting. And essentially what they kind of did here is they just kind of looked through a lot of the background of the literature, looking into some of those claims, investigating whether or not we can really kind of stand firm in our assumption that that is the case. So they did a pretty good job kind of walking through The fact that neutral spine is really a very small or kind of condensed range of motion, where we're thinking about it's not any one specific degree, but rather something between 0 and like 10 degrees is kind of what they found. And really what they found with a lot of the studies that they kind of examined here was it's very difficult to maintain any sort of neutral spinal posture when we get under any sort of load. So they kind of walked through and asked the question about whether or not the spine actually remains neutral during a lifting exercise. So if we're operating under the assumption that we can maintain this and that there is some sort of benefit to it, can we actually do that? A lot of the research that they pulled up showed that doesn't seem to be the case, even in a number of studies where people were actively cued to try to maintain some sort of lordotic curve or neutral spine. We were seeing degrees of spinal flexion up to 30 degrees and things like that. So kind of moving into the second part of the paper, they did an investigation on whether or not we can make claims about assumption of a neutral spine with loading exercise is actually protective. And a lot of the literature right now seems to suggest that there might be something there, but it's not really firm enough to really be sound or put forth any sort of recommendation with a lot of certainty. And then through the rest of the paper, they kind of looked at possible reasons why the assumption of something beyond a neutral spine may actually be positive or beneficial from a performance standpoint. So I'll kind of just dive in here on kind of what I thought with regard to this, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. So I think for the most part, for me, if we kind of came away from this paper under the assumption that it doesn't matter how we approach like a maximal sort of lift with regard to no attention to spinal flexion, I think that's probably a misguided takeaway. Because I do think from some of the evidence that they put forth, the idea that we should be somehow encouraging or maybe be more receptive to maximal spinal flexion and that it doesn't matter. I'm not in a position now where I would be willing to stand firmly with that position. If anything, what I think this paper says to me is that there's likely a larger bandwidth of acceptability, for lack of a better term, with regard to spinal flexion in a bilateral lifting task or something like that. So I think suffices to say, this is something that I believe John actually left me with as a little bit of a plug for the CA powerlifting course. Is we probably need to ask ourselves the question of whether or not, how comfortable are we with what we're seeing in front of us and stacking performance on that. And I think asking that question is probably going to provide the most insight or direction as to whether or not we want to intervene with some of that. So my current position is that there's likely a lot broader range of spinal flexion that I would be comfortable with, but the extremes is something that I'm still not going to necessarily be advocating for.
Well said, Kevin.
Yeah. That's what I got.
I'm just going to go this rest of this meeting without saying anything since the system doesn't want me on here anyway. Anybody have any thoughts? I have something here. I'm curious. I'm going to launch a poll that I made after So there's two questions. I'm real curious in the room here. So question one, are you considering changing your own lifting technique as a result of reading this paper? These poll questions are in front of you right now. And then question number two, are you considering changing the way you coach or cue certain lifts after reading this paper? Because I think a lot of people in this cohort are probably, I know Chris said that he interviewed the lead author, but a lot of people in this cohort are probably familiar with Greg Lehman already with his work. And so probably weren't super surprised if you were familiar, as kind of the narrative of the paper. I'm going to show you guys this poll. This is interesting. So the majority of you say, no, probably not going to change the way that I lift just from reading this paper, but there's more of a split in terms of coaching or cueing. So maybe it's kind of like we're okay with how we do it and cue ourselves, but maybe, you know, we'll let up on the cueing, or let our patients or athletes explore a little bit more, kind of what you were saying, Kevin. So that's like, they did good job in the paper of kind of defining neutral right off the bat. Cause I think right then and there, it's hard to have this conversation if you don't do that. Cause their definition of neutral was more of a kind of a tissue mechanics definition, where neutral was staying in the toe region of the connective tissue of the spine, meaning just enough stretch to uncrimp the collagen, but not so much to actually create any kind of elastic strain, which is not very much motion, as they alluded to. It doesn't take that much to get out of neutral in that regard. But to your point, Kevin, I guess I've always conceptualized neutral as this conceptual range of consistent output or consistent outcome. So whatever position of the spine that affords you mechanical leverage under increasing loads or increasing stress or increasing velocity, that then doesn't degrade consistently with those increased stressors, that kind of holds steady. Neutral is anything within that. And I always kind of put task and performance first, as I think they started to allude to in this paper, and as you were questioning that as well. Chris, go.
Yeah. So one of my questions was, like, they're talking about passive structures, right? Neutral was created by kind of the middle ground of the passive structures, but neutral would not be certainly not the position of most mechanical advantage for the musculature, right? So there's a difference there, in like just in problem solving, that to me, because the way that they found neutral, and again, some of this I knew, some of this comes from the interview with Lewis, who was just a genuinely awesome human. Like it's really nice to hear some of this stuff, but they had him sidelined, so they put him on a table. And this is some of McGill's stuff. They put him on a table and basically flexed the spine passively and measured the resistance to movement, and basically found that when they met some threshold Newton or Newton meter, then that was the point at which they removed themselves from or got in the elastic zone, as opposed to the or got out of the elastic zone. I'm sorry. So it was purely passive in a sideline position. But it's interesting, right? So that would be considered neutral, passive, sidelining, but that wouldn't be necessarily the position of most advantage, because as weird as it seems, it sounds like more spine flexion gives us a mechanical advantage to perform a deadlift. So there's a bit of a difference between saying neutral to the passive structures and then most advantageous from a mechanical advantage.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. With all the papers that showed that a change in lumbar curvature happens just kind of inevitably at the bottom of a start position, at the bottom of a squat. Even they didn't include one paper that I cite quite frequently. It's McKean is the lead author from 2010. They showed as soon as you unrack the bar with even just 50% of your 1 rep max back squat, just standing there, you start to reverse your lumbar curve a little bit. So, but all of those movements seem to take the lifter out of that biomechanical neutral anyway. So I don't know if the exploration of more flexion beyond that would matter. So you get down into what feels like a strong deadlift position, or you get down to the bottom of your squat, you already know just inherently there's been some change in spinal curvature. Just brace from there. It seems like going beyond that is already the diminishing returns factor, because the inevitable flexion seems like enough to put the muscles in mechanical advantage, kind of like what you were saying, Chris. I guess I just, it's so individual. Just don't be, I guess my thing is like, don't be surprised after reading this when you're like, oh shit, I'm going to flex my spine more. Don't be surprised if that doesn't feel strong.
Yeah. What the other thing that he brought up that I didn't consider is, so as soon as you put or add compression to the spine, right? Put a bar on your back, let's say a back squat. That compression obviously drives force down through the disc, through the annulus, and creates hoop stress, right? So it pushes out from the inside. And then the neutral zone at that point basically disappears. So in an unloaded spine, you can move the spine through arguably 20%. That may be a given segment moving 20% of its available motion, or maybe 20 or 30 degrees of a neutral position where the passive structures are still not being stressed. But as soon as you add compression to it, that hoop stress creates and decreases the amount of neutral zone position to what Lewis said is you're likely not even, it doesn't even exist anymore. So there may not even be a neutral anymore as soon as you put weight on your back.
Antonio, you're on.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Could everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right, awesome. I'm liking this, guys. You guys are spitting a lot of kinematic knowledge. I'm already loving this. So, I thought this article was very interesting, and what I kind of find even most interesting about it is almost like where this really kind of stemmed from, right? This kind of stemmed from, I don't know, for me, I call this bro science, right? The bro science is always keep the back neutral, always keep the back flat, keep it stabilized as much as we can. That's that old school mentality of, you heard some guy in the gym tell you about this and that was the way of doing it. And I find it very interesting now that we're kind of pushing the buttons a little bit here on what really is, neutral. I feel like the word neutral kind of has a definition around, and I'm really glad, like you and Kevin said, that they really, accentuated what this is. But back to going to what I was talking about the article with Gregory Lehman. He actually just released a podcast on Physio Network where I highly recommend everyone to listen to it. And he gives a really good analogy on what lumbar flexion and lifting is. He compares it to something called he calls it the willow tree analogy. So a willow tree is a very strong tree. It can blow in the wind, it can move, it can twist, it can dance with the wind, but it never breaks. And that's how he kind of treats the lumbar flexion and the lumbar quote unquote neutral. We have these motions that are not necessarily bad, but like a willow tree, when we maximally go into one motion on the other, that's when we kind of see the problem. So I thought that was a really good analogy that he uses. I would highly recommend people checking that out. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think he's done a few. He was on the Clinical Athlete podcast. This was probably a year and a half ago. Similar concept, but obviously this paper hadn't come out, but I know he's done a couple podcasts since. That probably, I like to listen to podcasts from the authors of papers, because it's one thing to read the paper yourself. It's kind of nice to then kind of hear it from their perspective and then compare that to your thought process as well. Jordan, you're up.
Hey guys, is that why, it might be a dumb question, but I know like when some doctors, when they're doing like return to play, they always say like do the safety bar squat first, then the front rack, and then they'll say back squat in reference to what you guys were saying. For a back squat, when you place it on or rack, it automatically pushes them into kind of alters the alignment of the spine. Would this article add some efficacy for utilizing maybe like a safety bar and a front rack versus like the back squat first? Because it kind of, I guess, biases you to more of a lumbar flex position, if that kind of makes any sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And the study that I referenced, specifically, we're assuming that everybody's read that, doctors have read that study. So I don't, a lot of times a safety bar squat is specific to a diagnosis like a shoulder or something like that, where you can't get your shoulder into a position. So having the safety squat bar handles in front of you just affords that. But I'm not sure if there would be any difference. In the paper that I was referencing, it was a high bar back squat. So I don't necessarily see there being much difference between a safety squat bar or a high bar, straight bar position. But I'm not sure. It's a good question. I don't know if there's enough data around that to recommend different squat variations based on how much change in spinal curvature you assume there will be. But obviously open to what others think there. It's an interesting question.
Go ahead. Go ahead,
I
Megan.
was gonna say, I think Adam was the next person that had to comment.
Not you,
Yeah, yeah,
Chris.
yeah.
Adam. Okay.
Yeah, it's me. Hi.
Chris, you can go next.
All right, nice, thanks. So I don't know, they didn't really cover too much on anthropometrics. So I was expecting there to be a little bit more on that, because that's going to make a pretty big impact on how they're going to squat, and how much flexion you're going to have to go into, depending on how long your torso is, how long your femurs are. So as a coach, I think that's where it comes into play, where you got to really kind of see, you got to use your eyes on what you're dealing with in front of you. And then I didn't see butt wink mentioned, which is a good thing. It's kind of a buzzword, I'd say, but I would expect them to have mentioned something about butt wink. I don't know how it plays in, but I don't know if anyone has any input on butt wink and how this plays in at all, but let's talk. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's probably similar. Lumbar spine flexion, kind of concurrent with pelvic rotation. But here, I'm just going to drop the link to that article I keep talking about. I think this one is probably specific. They looked at sacral movement as well. So I think as far as the butt wink conversation, that would be a good one. And then also in part 2 of the paper, when they started just going down the line saying this study, this movement showed this amount of flexion, boom, 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 boom. If you pull a few of those papers, they looked at sacral movement as well. But anthropometric considerations kind of comes back to the individual, right? Chris, go ahead.
Oh no, my comment was about the safety bar squat, and I genuinely, and I don't mean this to like pick on a profession, but I'm serious. I think plenty of people don't know what a safety bar squat is, and they think like, oh, that sounds nicer, that sounds safer, you should do that instead of like bad, dangerous squat lifting because your back will explode. I'm serious.
Because of the word safety?
Because I'm serious, yes.
I never thought about that. That's funny.
Yes.
That's probably true.
And then Adam, to your comment about the anthropometrics, I totally agree. I don't think they were specifically suggesting a type of movement. I mean, I asked Lewis this as well. I'd love to have him back on and talk about this, but I think what his big take home was, we are encouraging and empowering and championing people to explore a little bit within reason. His big comment was, Kevin, what you said in the beginning is exactly in line with what he said. He's still not advocating for end range flexion, or supra physiologic flexion, which you could argue kind of like the ACL may happen after you injure your disc. Like somebody flexes beyond their capabilities when they injure the disc in that subsequent kind of experience, that high velocity moment is created because you lose some stability from the disc if you damage it or what have you. But he says the same thing. I'm not advocating. He's like, I use Jefferson curls, but I think in range loaded flexion just as much as in range loaded extension is probably not beneficial. But the difference between neutral and everything outside of end range is arguable and negligible. I mean, we have no idea. That listening to some of Greg's stuff as well, and Quinn, Kevin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Like some of the studies that the old McGill papers, right, where it was a pretty small amount of flexion that they were cycling the spines through, and looking at almost like a material study. They were just taking these spines, flexing them to, it's like 20%, 20 to 30 degrees. It wasn't a lot, and just seeing when they ruptured. And it was, I mean, I'm looking here, like one of the papers they reference on, yeah, I mean, 10,000 times under, 1,500 Newtons of force, of compressive force. I mean, that's a lot. Nobody's deadlifting. Nobody's doing this that many times. And so, if it's only 20 to 30 degrees and we can't stop that from happening anyway, I mean, everybody is a ticking time bomb, right? Like I hate that mentality that you only have, 10,000 licks and it's going to explode. That can't be real. I mean, that narrative for me is kinesiophobic, and I think that's super dangerous, right?
I think that was something that I thought was really interesting. I think it was toward the latter part of the paper, but they were basically saying that, roughly 75% of this is genetic or hereditary based in terms of the presence of disc injuries. So all you can really do is either pick your parents better and just cross your fingers and hope that you adapt eventually with an appropriate training load. So I think it's an interesting question because it doesn't really seem like there's a lot you can do because we know that you can't maintain a neutral spine anyways. So if anything, maybe the cueing or the coaching should be, let's just try to avoid, because I think compression, like you said, Chris, definitely seems to change things a little bit, but let's just try to avoid end range loaded spinal flexion more than anything, and everything else just kind of let it go.
But you could, if you started with a high hang position, like a top down, like RDL process, you could probably hinge to a point and maintain your spine, I think, much. But if you have to pick something up from the floor, I don't think that there's any chance, I don't care how you move, that you don't incur probably a lot. I mean, from Greg and some of their stuff, we're talking 70, 80% of max flexion to pick something up off the floor, and max flexion being a Jefferson curl. I mean, 80%, that's a lot. So if you're picking something up off the ground, yes. If you're picking, like doing a top down RDL, maybe from a rack position or something, I mean, that hinge position, I would assume would be more advantageous. I would assume most of us probably do that anyway, right? And somebody with a back injury, maybe.
Yeah, I think that injury and pain aside, movement efficiency emerges as you explore certain positions. If anybody here has worked at manual labor jobs or gardening or construction or anything where you've had repetitive positions, you move around and you explore and you find certain positions that are kind of more conducive to doing the task over and over and over and over again, and you just gravitate towards those things. And I don't necessarily know if the weight room needs to be any different. Maybe the coach is nudging one way or another, just to kind of expedite the process a little bit in case the person is coming in with absolutely no context for the movements at all. But then you kind of step back and you let them explore a little bit. And like you guys are saying, I think if anything else, this just gives us a little bit more confidence that there's more wiggle room there than the general narrative is usually espouses. Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, guys. So like when they say like take the slack out of the bar, like I feel myself almost pull those hamstrings under, and that's a natural kind of that posterior pelvic tilt, that kind of flexion position with that spine. It's right there. You're kind of loading up, and you're going to go into a little bit more flexion, and I'm okay with that. And I've never really been injured myself with that, so I'd say it's a fine position to get into. So that's what I'm saying. The whole fear of it is probably not a good thing. So, and then also, hold on, I think I'm good there. Yeah, that's it for now.
Cool. Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, sort of just to add to what Adam was saying and what you guys have been talking about. If we consider also, I'll be honest, I didn't get a chance to read the article because I just registered today, but adding in like the thoracolumbar fascia of like engaging the lats with pulling that slack out of the bar and getting more than just this passive position or this spinal position that we're looking at, of the engagement of everything around it as well, I feel like is an important aspect to consider when we're talking about that, like lifting things and moving heavy weight and adapting to those heavy loads.
Yeah, totally. And the task matters too, right? One of the examples that really resonated with me, and one that I always use because it seems like an extreme example, is a strongman stone lift. And they actually use that. And what was interesting is those flexion values were supra maximal flexion versus a standing forward bending test. If anybody's ever held a stone or tried to pick up a stone, you kind of conform your body around the stone. So the weight of the stone almost leverages you into more flexion. But there was two parts here that were interesting, where they say at this time, it remains unclear how athletes such as strongman competitors are able to flex their spine far beyond their unloaded maximum against incredibly high resistances without incurring catastrophic damage. When I first read that, I thought, okay, there's a certain technique to, they're not just Jefferson curling the stone from a forward bend position with straight knees and then curling it up. They squat down, they put it on their thighs, and then they wrap their body around it. So, but then they follow up with their ability to skillfully coordinate their movements so that time points where spinal loads are greatest do not coincide simultaneously with the spine being flexed. So I guess I just come back to task, individual, environment. And for me, this paper confirms that exploration, that we have wiggle room and there's exploration there, but there's a reason why, on average, when you look at somebody's barbell snatch starting position, doesn't look like somebody who's picking up an Atlas stone off of the ground, because the implement dictates a lot of the positions that we start in. So for me, I love papers like this, but I also find that they tend to swing the pendulum a little bit too far, and don't necessarily have to change everything. Maybe just the narrative of how we spin it, but that I don't want to. What I want to do is break out, because I want people to talk about this. So I'm going to start putting some prompts into the chat. I'm going to put a couple here that we started with the poll. So I'd like you guys to talk about if anything is going to change in your practice or your own training. So I'm dropping these prompts into the chat right now. This is what you guys are going to talk about. And then Megan's got some good ones for us. Here's one. Have you ever helped patients or clients understand this type of research? So would you bring this out from like an education standpoint if somebody was demonstrating fear avoidance or had been told something that maybe you kind of want to shift that belief a little bit? And then have you ever been advised by a professional, maybe if there's students here, maybe one of your CIs was kind of really constraining the way that movement should be coached or something like that, or a colleague that you have mutual patience with, because that can get kind of dicey as well when the patient's hearing kind of two different ways of framing a movement. So we're going to break out. We'd love for you to stay around. For all the introverts in the room, it's always better after you've done it. You're like, oh, I'm so glad I stayed. Okay. If I remember how to do this. Here we go. All right, we are off. Is everybody back? I think so. Cool. Well, I am proud. This is the most that we had stay for the breakouts and be here after the breakout. So that's awesome. That just means that we're getting to know each other a little bit better and we like each other enough to stay around. So who talked about some cool stuff?
Room 6 was where I was at when it was a good time, and we talked about some cool things. One thing that we kind of brought up was it's like two extremes, right? So you have somebody that has, maybe like a 14-year-old that has hyperextension, right? That huge lordotic curve. And so what happens there? And then we talked about the other extreme, right? A heavy power lifter like Blaine Sumner that can almost squat 1,200 pounds. And you have them on that factor. So it's kind of interesting how, once again, the lower back is just really good at adapting, whether it's huge, heavy loads or too much mobility. So we had a good convo about that.
Anybody have thoughts on that or any other thoughts that you shared in your group?
Well, Quinn, to build on that, I think that's exactly right, Antonio. I would agree with you that we need to be careful and make it a point to be on the same page as far as patient or client population. If we're talking about somebody with a symptomatic back, for whatever diagnosis you want to put to that, or somebody that's doing it for performance. I love that they talked about the concept that, again, flexing or posterior pelvic tilt during a deadlift moves the bar closer, therefore improves your mechanical advantage to pull that weight. So there's actually an advantage to flexing. That's not, most people would say that's dangerous. And this person likely isn't doing it intentionally. They're doing it because they have selected a pattern that allows them to pull a weight that is very, very, very heavy, right? Into the realm of their 1RM or, potentially close to it. versus somebody in pain where maybe just, Quinn, I brought something up that I forgot to bring up earlier with Lewis is he said, if you consider the fact that most of us, when you have a back injury, you tend to, right, you co-contract. Everybody would agree with this, right? They feel rigid, you feel rigid. You actually create compression. So you remove the neutral, like you remove quote unquote any realm of neutral, because your co-contraction actually compresses the spine. So that's, any movement at all is going to load the tissue that is potentially damaged, when in reality, some of our word choices, some of the education may just be that relaxation where that neutral returns, or whatever neutral you want to define, that didn't exist because you're not so completely tonic, from a muscular standpoint.
Sean, you're up.
Cool. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
Two things. First of all, Quinn, it's my first time here, but you've got Chris Juno on here, and I just don't know how I feel about that. So I might never return after this. But no, I'm just kidding. I used to work with Chris. Yeah, yeah. I'm sure you got a lot of complaints about him. The second thing that we talked about in our little breakout group, which I think will be interested to hear what you guys, the collective crew, has about this. But in this study, and this is always the hard part, is managing kind of research and clinical practice when it comes to measuring what neutral is, right? None of us are going to be laying people down and sideline and hooking them up to some type of load gauge to determine, where the tissues tolerances are and things like that. So I guess one thing that I think of is, what are we using in clinical practice to assess what neutral is? And then how are we determining, okay, this amount of flexion is okay for this person, this amount of extension is okay for this person, and all of those things. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, I talked to the small group about kind of what I use in clinical practice, but I would be curious to hear if anybody else has anything to add.
If it's radio silence for 10 seconds, Sean, everybody wants to know what you do.
Okay, has it been 10 seconds?
I don't know yet.
Do it, Sean.
Maybe not.
Hit it.
Okay. Yeah. So I think, I was talking to the other group. One of the things that I use, because I think, Quinn, you mentioned this pendulum, and that I use that example with my residents all the time. And it's so important when it comes to interpreting research, right? We've got on one end of the pendulum, flexion is bad, never bend for the rest of your life. And on the other end of the pendulum is everyone can bend at all times. And both of those two things are kind of a problem. And that's really what it comes down to, is how are we finding the balance? That's what it comes down to. And so for me, the only time that I would consider avoiding flexion is if we have tissues that I feel like that are going to be loaded more in flexion. So i.e. the disc, and I want to give it more time to heal. Okay. And so one of the things that I use in clinical practice is I will put people in slump tests, so we know we're sensitizing the nervous tissue, and if I can reproduce their symptoms with a slump test, when I add axial compression, that tells me that we're probably not ready to load them in a flexion-based position, so to speak, because they have some sensitivity to axial loading. And so I basically put the disc and put the nerve at a big disadvantage, and I add a kind of, my own mechanical axial loading to see if that elicits symptoms. And that's done really well for me, because it allows me to have some objective measure to make sure I'm not overloading people too quickly. Because if you see enough people with spine, you will have patients that you get back into lifting too fast after radicular symptoms and, potentially reperipheralize. So that's one of the things that I use.
Sean, would you, in that scenario, what if so say you had a positive test, and we'll call positive test just symptoms with what you just described, but you were able to constrain a movement, let's call it a trap bar deadlift on blocks or off the rack or something like that, where they're able to bend their knees. So with the trap bar is nice because you can make it more squatty, and then you can, manipulate the range of motion. But considering that positive test, would you still try to find an entry point to some type of movement?
100%. Because we know that if our goal, again, if we said, hey, this person's got discogenic radiculopathy, we know that in order to have, these type of radicular symptoms, there's probably some level of annular tearing, annular damage. We know that's going to reabsorb in, 60, 70% of the people within 6 to 9 months. That's what's going to happen. That's what the literature kind of shows us. And so we know that tissue's sensitive. But we also know that by loading it, by exercising around it, that's going to help facilitate healing of the disc. And so it's all about trying to manage that load appropriately. Now, the hard part comes is obviously we know, the amount of muscle mass somebody has is going to increase or decrease rigidity in the spine. And so that's going to, again, it's about finding that balance, like you said. So absolutely, I'll reduce the range of motion, reduce the load. If I can find a way where we can do the motion partially and without peripheralization, then I'm all for it.
Awesome. Anybody's thoughts on that? Thanks for sharing that, Sean. Really appreciate that. Thoughts on that, or thoughts that you shared in your group?
Sean, do you do similar things for extension, or is it only flexion based tasks?
No, I think I do it for most things. I've had at this point, kind of in my clinical practice, I would say probably 60% of my patients are weird nerve pain patients. And so I'll get some of these weird lateral or, kind of atypical disc herniations where they feel fine in flexion completely, and they'll peripheralize like crazy in extension. And you got to get really creative with how you're testing and assessing and then reintegrating load, especially like getting back into walking or running. I had a couple of joggers with really, really weird, kind of ridiculous symptoms. And so, yeah, absolutely. I would say take the same approach no matter what position sensitizes it, right?
I'm curious if anybody going the other way, almost kind of similar to what you're saying, Sean, who are flexion sensitive, have purposely cued a little bit more extension just as a temporary way to, again, as an entry point to load. I almost feel like sometimes we feel a little bit dirty when every now and then a clinical scenario presents itself that would have us in a temporary state or short-term strategy, have us do the opposite of what we would generally cue. And we always feel like we shouldn't, but if we're abiding by principles of just kind of like exploring, maybe sometimes we go the other way, and it's the same rules apply. It just happens to be that the narrative that is usually espoused is flexion is bad, flexion is bad, flexion is bad. That doesn't necessarily mean that, like you guys are saying, flexion is tolerated to the degree that these movements typically put us in. So we manipulate the movement itself. Maybe we change up our cues, but the education, I think, maybe a lot of us would agree that that's important as well. Why we're doing it? What's the narrative behind the, directional preference, right? And I've never taken a McKenzie course, so.
I had a comment on that, Quinn.
Sure.
Every time I say a forward or self-organized or any motor learning word, my ears perk up. No, but like regarding, that concept of exploring, like especially somebody who's like dealing with something that's unfamiliar to them, the experience of an injury, or maybe they're not familiar with like exploring that for themselves, maybe because they were never taught how to do that, or it's new to them. I think that's something that it gets lost when we're trying to find like an exercise, like how do we address this mechanically? Like what are we looking for in terms of how we can get this person moving? And then like I feel like sometimes what gets lost is like that conversation of like getting feedback of what that person is experiencing as they explore, whereas just kind of going back to that exploration, like I think that has a lot to do with being able to explore positions that maybe they're not familiar with, and while doing that, getting them more accustomed to what they perceive originally was like very maybe dangerous to them, but just by going through that process helps them feel better. I just think just a comment, I just feel like that's lost sometimes, or I feel like when I listen to certain conversations, it's like people are looking for like the exercise or the position that's the best, when really it's just a matter of maybe it's the process of exploring the positions. It's not one actual exercise that really matters. But anyway, that was just a comment in response to what you mentioned.
Yeah, just as you're saying that, James, I'm just picturing a patient with a kettlebell between their legs up on a block that maybe puts it at like knee height, and you kind of show them how to do this with their back. Basically, they bend down and just grab the kettlebell, and then you show them how to do a cat camel with their back, and you let them play around. Like, you take your spine here, take your spine there, anywhere in between. I want you to find the position that you're comfortable with, that you feel good about picking up that weight, and just kind of let them play around. You step back, maybe, maybe they've got it like 3 feet in front of them or something like that. So you might put their hips over but just little things, not telling them how to do it, but showing them how to explore, like what you were saying. Sean, go ahead.
It's mind if I, go for it.
Oh, I'm sorry. So no. You go ahead, Dylan. My bad.
I was just going to add in something that we were sort of talking about in our groups was somewhat along the same lines of like when you're like cueing or providing sort of feedback for that individual, maybe sometimes directing their attention away from what it is that you are looking at. Like, let's say it's spinal flexion, rather than saying, hey, try and keep your back straight or do these sorts of things. We were talking about in our group sort of like, hey, maybe think about keeping your chest up high, or just sort of like directing your attention away from something so that they can find a different goal and see if that produces a different outcome.
Shift that focus externally. I like it. Sean, you had a quick thought?
Yeah, just echoing what James was saying. One of the things that I had a fellowship mentor do this with his patients, and I've taken it and run with it with a couple of mine as well. But I'll tell sometimes patients, especially if there's a lot of fear avoidance stuff, if I think that they're really ready and we've had the conversation, they're still avoiding certain motions, I'll have them do exercises like, hey, get in quadruped. I want you to get in quadruped, and I want you to try to then go from quadruped to a sitting position without letting your butt touch the ground, and then stand up. And having them explore all of those motions, right? The amount of motion you get into between just kind of rotating your body and standing up, it's all external feedback, and they get to kind of explore and do how they want to. There's no like, you have to do it exactly like this. I've had really, really good results with that because they start doing things differently and realizing, okay, this is comfortable and this is not. And next thing you know, they're moving in ways that they haven't, and it doesn't hurt. And so it's almost like you're letting them prove it to themselves that they're feeling better, if that makes sense. But I think it's similar to what James was saying, and it's worked really, really well.
Yeah, I've experimented with that too, going from just like tall kneeling to like half kneeling to standing type positions, and just basically you're minimizing as much cueing as you want for them. You're just basically like, go from this position to this position, and however you get there doesn't really matter. So I've found that to work pretty well too. It's interesting how that there's kind of a similar thread across there. I don't know why. I suppose it's maybe just because we're not getting them to focus internally as much and more just kind of feel the movement out. So that's an interesting touch point.
The other thing is to load it so heavy that they don't feel anything other than their soul. But maybe that's just me. Go ahead, whoever was saying something.
Oh, I was just going to follow up with kind of going back to the idea of like how someone's action capabilities, what they can or can't do influences what they see as opportunities for them to act on. And if you think about like what an injury does, it just completely shifts like shifts a person's action capabilities, whether that be like short-term, long-term. And just recognizing that as a clinician, I think it changes your mindset in approaching injury, where like you're just now there to help them better calibrate to what they currently can do based on the injury, because they might not have a good perception of that. And maybe that's why those transitions that you were mentioning, Kevin, like work so well with minimal cueing, because maybe you're good enough to like give them a task that maybe helps to help them better understand that. And that could be help them dramatically change their perception of like what they're actually experiencing. And I feel like I've experienced that just by like talking to them, helping patients like kind of better understand what they're doing, but telling them to give me some feedback. I don't know, just that exploration has definitely changed like pain in the immediate sense, like drastically in a couple of occasions. I don't know what exactly is happening, but it's definitely interesting though.
This Artha says in the chat, she tried to cue herself into more of a neutral spine because she generally has a slightly flexed spine, but then cueing neutral made her feel weaker. I'm curious, Bess, why were you trying to get out of that slightly flexed spine when you deadlift? Was there a problem with that, or was it more of kind of what maybe we've talked about, kind of the narrative behind the position? I'm curious there. Adam, you want to talk about what you're thinking there?
Yeah. So I was thinking about the like that taking the slack out of the bar, that little wedging technique, instead of thinking about almost pulling that bar off the floor, I'm thinking about like really pushing and imparting all as much force as I can into the floor and using my hips to kind of, leverage that thing out. So, I mean, I think that flex position is better for that wedging technique as opposed to kind of getting into that extension, that more neutral, as she said. So I think it messes with the sequence from my perspective.
You mentioned some movement intent can set up for suboptimal sequence off the floor.
Right.
What were you talking about the some of the movement exploration stuff that we were?
I think what I meant by that is when she said she came out of that kind of flex position into more of that extension neutral position. I think what that does is maybe the intent is more, I'm going to lift it with my back. It could set up for that suboptimal movement pattern. I feel like, instead of kind of pushing into the floor and getting that up. That's just my thought on why she maybe felt weaker. Maybe it's just a sequencing thing potentially.
And Bess, you can obviously unmute yourself as well if you want to chime in. Otherwise, Chris, you had thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Adam, to your point, right? Internal versus external, like center and focus, right? Like instead of pushing, now you're thinking of pulling, and your back is the center of focus, and so naturally you pick that thing. But the point to Bess, what he made, I'm sorry, is it's interesting to think like one of the first things I said is neutral, meaning some arbitrary middle ground. That, I mean, Bess, how did you define what neutral was? Did you just think, well, my back needs to be straighter, so I'm just going to straighten it out? And that's maybe a less advantageous muscular position, which made it feel harder, right? Like we said earlier, neutral was defined as kind of passive structures, not necessarily the point of optimum force output, which may be a little bit more flexed according to what some of these things are saying.
Yeah, I wanted to confirm what Adam was kind of saying, is that like when I was trying to make my back more neutral, I was kind of thinking about just going into more of extension, because I would look at videos and be kind of like very slightly flexed. And when I normally pull, I think about like driving my feet, like pushing the floor away. But when I was trying to pull with a more neutral back, I was like, all right, let me just try to extend a little bit. And it definitely felt weaker. So yeah, you're right.
Anna asked a good question too. She said she's wondering if variations in positions affect the ability for you to use your legs. I think they kind of touched on that a little bit. See, I'm coming from a weightlifting perspective, and the way you pull a snatch or a clean off the floor is not necessarily how you go to a powerlifting meet and pull your deadlifts off the floor. They're different positions, but they mentioned, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but they mentioned that increased hip flexion, which I was interpreting as a lower hip start, because I had to figure out what they actually meant. Because I know if you do a lumbar lordosis, you are also effectively flexing your hip because you're going to anterior pelvic tilt. But I think they were meaning a low hip position to flex more hip flexion decreases the moment arm for the hips. Whereas if you have a slightly flexed spine and a higher hip position, you've increased the moment arm from hips to bar, and you actually have more pull, or the ability to produce more torque from the glutes and the hamstrings. That was my interpretation. But again, would that not still just come down to you going to the gym and experimenting with your technique? And you have to do it with increasingly heavier loads too, because sometimes the stuff that feels good and works with the lighter loads, you kind of figure out like, oh, this doesn't really like translate, if the goal is approaching max. So it's a great question. I would say the answer is yes, but to what extent for the individual? It's a tough, I don't think we can generalize.
I agree with that entirely, that obviously there's art to this because not everyone's the same, not every clinician's the same, and there's the integration. I've noticed though that a lot with like Olympic lifting background, I tend to get, if there's a guy that's a big Olympic lifter, he's doing lots of snatches, lots of cleans, there tends to be a better, if you tell them to cue the pull via push off the ground, a lot of times they tend to lift it much better, much more comfortably. Because I think it's because a lot of, depending on the programming too, because not every lifting program is the same, but a lot of that high bar, deep squat position, if you tell them to push off the ground as hard as they can, they kind of revert to kind of that movement pattern more. And if you kind of give them that pull mentality, they're going to keep that back straight because that's what they've been doing the vast majority of their lifting. And then they'll be able to do a better deadlift. In general, that tends to be the cues that the external cues that tend to help that patient population. But then again, it depends on, the training background of the patient and or athlete, depending on what their goals are. And that just tends to be a reoccurring pattern that I've noticed, because I worked a lot with Olympic lifters at one gym and then a lot of power lifters in the other. And then there was a bunch of cross-pollination when they all made their one big gym, and then people trying different things. So yeah, that's just all I have to add. When you added lifting and all that and snatching and stuff, I just wanted to throw that in there. Hope you guys find that useful.
Appreciate that, TJ. I hope there weren't any gang wars in that gym after the powerlifters and weightlifters crossed paths.
Only the strong survive, right?
That's right. Well, yeah, that's why the weightlifters get to make fun of the powerlifters for being slow, and the powerlifters make fun of the weightlifters for being weak.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, I think to that point, it could just be the attractor state that the person is most familiar with too at that point too, in terms of like their position and pull off the floor.
Right.
So it probably would fall in the lines of more deliberate practice in terms of if you're really trying to change or alter the hip position when you're starting with. So like you said, if you're going to go to a snatch or pull off the floor, push press or something like that, the setup should be different, should it not, versus just a straight, pull deadlift from the floor.
Generally. Yeah, my hip, for a max effort deadlift, it's been a while, but my hips are generally a little higher, kind of shoulders are behind the bar, like that flexion moment, exactly what they were talking about in the paper. But when you have to take that bar and put it somewhere else besides just standing up with it, put it on your front rack or over your head, there's a certain trajectory then that you have to kind of follow with your body that makes it a less advantageous pull off the floor, because the weights are not maximal deadlift weights. That's why, again, my foundational principle is task, individual, environment. But Kevin, you make a really good point. I was just looking at the chat and saw Jason Torrey's name, but I always think about like changing technique with like runners, how hard it is. And your point is well taken, where just because you go into the gym and try a new technique once it doesn't feel as strong, doesn't necessarily mean that it wouldn't, if you put the months of time into it that would be required to kind of reshape your attractor and make that your default. Maybe it wouldn't take months, but it would take some time. Who truly like does that? Because that's time that you're basically rolling the dice a little bit. Because if that doesn't go well, that's, a couple blocks where we're just like, okay, well, I'll just go back to what I was doing. So that was kind of a waste. So you make a good point in that regard.
Our group had covered a little bit on the speed of the pull, of course, is, we're talking a little bit more of a speed strength when we're talking Olympic lifting. We're talking rigidity. So we want to keep that kind of neutral, that flex position, and that's going to be a better force transfer, because rigidity is usually better force transfer. And then in terms of powerlifting, you got a long time to do that. You got a long time to develop that force. So you'll probably be all right in a little bit more movement, less rigid, I suppose, in some ways, as you're slowly bringing that bar off for max force. You know what I mean?
Yeah, a lot of like the core, the abdominal research and the breathing research showing how reflexive those things are, like your intra-abdominal pressure and your the spinal stiffness that the system exhibits increases linearly with the stress that's put upon it without cueing. So you automatically inhale more and create more intra-abdominal pressure as the load gets heavier. You automatically do that more as the whatever perturbation comes faster. You exhale less. So all these things are reflexive without cueing. And so again, it kind of comes back to, like lifting something heavy is maybe a different task in and of itself. Even a deadlift is a deadlift, but is a light deadlift a heavy deadlift? And so it's potentially a different stressor, just even from like a self-organization standpoint, which is tough if somebody's, in a certain degree of symptoms where they can't tolerate intensity. But maybe like an isometric rack pull where you pull up against the pins, just so they can get some amount of load and exertion beyond what you can actually get with full range of motion or with repetitions. And I don't know why is that even a conversation about spinal flexion? Now we're just talking about training. Sweet. Anybody else have thoughts?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I was in a group with Chris and Jason, so we obviously didn't get to this question in the prompt. But
oh wow, was that a shade? Well, hold on. Did you just throw shade at Chris and Jason?
No, we had great
yes.
conversation. Otherwise, we just didn't get here. So I was interested to hear thoughts about like the kind of patient education piece, like kind of knowing this evidence, how people are kind of having these conversations with people.
What are your thoughts?
I'm a trainer. I don't have patients. So to you guys.
None of your clients have ever come to you complaining about their back?
Yeah. I typically just try to, like, it kind of depends on how well I know the person and how firm their beliefs are, if I care to challenge them at all, or if we just kind of roll with it, find positions that work for them right now, and then just like over time, maybe start to play with different ones that they might be fear avoidant in, versus like if they're fear avoidant in flexion, I'm not just going to probably start out with that right away. But obviously, I think this changes a lot once we bring like pain into the equation. So,
thoughts on that, anyone, from an education standpoint?
I mean, I could just, can I speak on that a little bit?
Sure.
Well, a part of mine is chiropractor. We see a lot with youth athletes training is that they tend to have a lot of thoracic pain, not so much lumbar pain. And so you rarely see, if you're dealing with lumbar flexion, you're probably going to be also in thoracic flexion as well. But the pain comes from thoracic flexion. And what we notice is that as they squat or they pull from the floor, that they're having thoracic pain. And if you videotape them, you see that as they lower themselves in the squat or raise themselves from the floor, there is a tipping point, a breaking point where the thoracic spine, you can see it move, and that's where the pain happens also. And so what we do is we limit their range of motion. We keep the squat limited so that they can stay in thoracic extension. And then we also start them higher off the floor on the pull so that they can also maintain a flat back. And so those both require lumbar extension or neutral lumbar. So I don't think in lumbar flexion you would be able to have thoracic extension, which is what we find seems to help.
I feel like,
go ahead.
I feel like from a patient education perspective, this paper is so helpful. It's almost like a public service announcement of like really giving us all the cohesive different thought processes of how this all relates, because I'd read a few of these papers up to this point, maybe even 5, but after going through this, I just feel like it gives me a little bit more of a foundational background with it. And while I felt comfortable making the small nudges over time with patients who were demonstrating, fear of lumbar flexion in and of itself, I think that, especially for the younger clinicians in the room, like Quinn had talked about already, about, you know, we don't want the pendulum to go too far either, but I think it's going to give a lot of people in our industry more confidence to hopefully not jam it down someone's throat, because we know that's not helpful, but to start comfortably providing nudges to the right patient at the right time. So I think it's pretty, I'm happy.
Miles, would you say that it would change what you would say, or would it change maybe more so your confidence in saying it?
I would say, yeah, I would say it would, I guess my threshold for having this conversation might have just gotten a little bit more sensitive. Like, I just feel a little bit, yeah, it wouldn't change what I would say, but it would change the comfort I'd have with saying it. And also, I think I there were just some things in this paper that I learned. And so now it's not even like I just feel more comfortable coaching people with a little bit more lumbar flexion, but I just feel like I have seen how it all ties together a little bit better.
I've got a quick thought, if it's okay. I feel like, I don't know what time this is supposed to end, but
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the things, you know, obviously the patient education piece, I feel like with all things, but especially with the spine, because there always is a pretty high level of fear avoidance stuff going on. Patient education is super, super important. I think the one take home here is that what I tell all patients, kind of no matter where they are on that fear avoidance spectrum, is that we will get back to flexion, or if it's extension they have a problem with, you know, we will get back to it. Okay. Depending on what's going on, it might take a little longer for some people, for others, but I set the stage at the beginning, like, this is something that we will get back to. That's a goal. It's not going to be something that we avoid forever. And then I talk about what my game plan is for reintroducing those activities, you know, and again, Quinn, you mentioned this before, but it all depends on, you know, who they are and what they want to do. Right. So if it's a power lifter, they might have some thoughts like, you know, I'm never going to be able to deadlift again, or whatever the case is. And so I'll tell them like, hey, we're going to do it. So put that as your end goal. That's point B. Point A is where we're at today. And then we'll talk about making a plan together to get there. So I think as long as we're doing those things, you know, we're not going to be too far off.
Gotta keep doing that. Does anybody have thoughts before I let Chris loose? All right, man, go ahead.
I don't even know if I want to share anymore.
Oh, don't be like
that.
that.
It doesn't feel like a safe space anymore.
You're
Quinn.
pouting. Oh.
No, and I'm gonna totally like steal something from Greg, because like he's got like 10 podcasts. I think he's done 2 recently on the NAF podcast with Adam Meekins. But they bring up a concept of an ankle sprain, if anybody's happened to listen to this, which I thought does a really good job of this. As in, you roll your ankle and you self-select somewhat of a limp, right? Where you may decrease your load bearing capacity on that limb. You may stay in like a bit of more of a plantar flex position and kind of offload that where your stance phase is pretty short. And that is a short-term solution to continue to exist and live, which I think is a very valid option. To your point you made earlier, Quinn, that we can pick things in the acute phase. Sean, same thing. Like, we can pick things in the acute phase to get people on with life. That doesn't mean that we're going to stay there forever. And it doesn't mean you need to limp forever. So if you want to self-select a very rigid, you know, back limited position or exercise initially, just to continue to keep you active, or that's the only way I can pick up like my groceries or get in and out of my car, that's totally fine. But I think papers like this, Miles, to what you were saying, just helps give us some credibility and say, yeah, it's okay. I know something happened. We're not sure why it happened, because you've done that thing plenty of time before, and whatever happened that day, don't worry. We're going to be able to get back to that. All the good research says that we're going to get there, but through a graded exposure over time. So right now, the way you're moving is totally fine, but we want to broaden that and expand that a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, where you get back to moving quote unquote normal. And I think papers like this, that gives me so much ammo. Not that I'm going to put this in front of somebody, but it makes me feel a hell of a lot better knowing that this fancy term of neutral spine, like this elusive fairy that we're chasing around, really may not exist in the way that we think it is. And that if people move differently, that's okay too, because nobody's going to move the same. And we have some variability in that. As long as it's done in a manner, again, that you can substantiate and validate it, and it's not a dramatic exposure or unanticipated, exposure in force, it's probably okay. And that's our job, I think, is more managing the exposure of those forces and dampening some of that kinesiophobia as much as, the healing is going to happen, right? That's not our job. The body better do that. If it doesn't, then we got other problems. That's my rant.
Chris, to your point, since you're just totally stealing the same example that I did in my small group, I'm sure you were probably eavesdropping on all of those.
That's what I do. I'm omnipresent. So
omnipresent. Yeah, exactly. One of the things I did as a young clinician is you kind of, patients always ask, like, what can I do and what can't I do? And you can make a list. Okay, you can do this, you can do that. And obviously that just changes so much. I stopped doing that. And obviously I answer specific questions that they have, but I give them, I call it their sandbox. Okay. So I give them some boundaries. So I tell them, like, if, we don't want to do anything that's going to peripheralize your nerve symptoms. We won't, I give them kind of guidelines to follow. And I tell them, you can do anything you want in your sandbox, literally anything you want. I don't care what it is. If you want to go, clean and jerk 225 today, and, but that those rules apply. So I get them in the gym, I get them back to as many activities as they can, and I let them learn how to self-regulate. Because Chris, what you're talking about with the ankle sprain is self-regulation, right? You sprain your ankle, you can't run. You have to kind of walk slowly, you limp, and then eventually it feels better and you walk a little faster, and then eventually it feels better and you run. And that's how our body's meant to heal. There's a lot of evidence that shows that's how we're supposed to gradually reintroduce those motions. So I try to focus more on teaching them what are some appropriate things to feel and what are maybe some less desirable things to feel. And I let them decide what activity they are going to do. And that's given me a lot more success because, you'll have the patient where you might tell them the first week, don't do this. And then, 7 weeks go by and they tell you, like, oh, I haven't done that since we talked last and I forgot to ask about it. So it's kind of removed some of those issues I found.
Can I add on that?
Please.
Just like that idea of being able to self-select or self-regulate. If someone has pain or is going to avoid things, how you describe things are going to contribute to what they're going to choose to self-regulate or put in their sandbox, as Sean put it. Like if they haven't brought up that they think that flexion is bad, then to have the conversation about the idea that flexion is not bad is actually not going to serve very well, right? Just let's do it different. And I come from the other side, from the personal trainers who have said things earlier. Like, I am a physio and I work closely with strength and conditioning coaches. So I see the athletes when the lift doesn't feel good anymore often, and it's not always a big injury. And so, in some cases, maybe they've already self-selected flexion as the way they like to do their lift, but that is no longer serving them well. Either, the load or their training or whatever else is going on in life, using flexion the way that they had is no longer serving them to let them do their thing and feel good. So I'm not going to start talking about how any ideas about flexion, good or bad. It's just for your body right now, let's try something that might feel better. And so your question at the beginning about, would you lift differently or would you coach differently? If someone is not in pain, I won't coach it at all for me in my role. And if someone is flexing, doesn't feel good, it's not because flexing is bad or dangerous. It's just that is not a way that seems to be advantageous for them at this moment. So let's find another way to squat and, and just coach that differently to find a movement pattern that's different, that still gets the job done, that feels good. And now that is how they're going to move forward. And for some people, you can do that quite well without ever having to have a discussion about good, bad, healthy, not dangerous, risky, whatnot. You just find something that their body is capable of and strong enough to do. And you might give accessories to support building strength, now holding their spine in a different position, or, squatting from a greater amount of hip flexion or whatever. And that's the education that they need to just move their body. You can stay away. You can stay away from the good and the bad and the dangerous and the safe. And then it doesn't even snowball from there. Because sometimes I've tried to do the right thing, and just by acknowledging that there is a conversation of good and bad and safe and not, it's made it worse, despite everything I try with the best of intentions and papers and science and analogies. Just sometimes moving in a way that feels good is good.
And they come back on visit too, and they were like, you know what I found? Back in 1999, Stuart McGill took a pig spine and he did it like this 37,000 times and it snapped. That's what you were talking about. Holy shit, I don't want that to happen to me. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That puts things into perspective, I think, for all of us as well. Like, make sure we're listening to the person and not injecting what we're afraid they're afraid of when maybe they're not.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
I think that might be a good place to end it tonight. This was a good one, everyone. This is a really good one. Megan just put the post-meeting survey in the chat, and any change that we've ever made to these meetings has been based on your feedback. So those are super valuable for us. Open that link up before we close out so you don't lose it. Chris, you got tremendous support in the chat. Since that, me almost booting you in the last 5 minutes or so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you to everybody for putting up with me, because Quinn almost kicked me out, and I would have never come back ever.
You can clearly.
Thank you, Megan.
Yes.
See,
the
I knew
majority
it.
has spoken. Well, everyone, thanks so much. We'll do another one in a couple weeks. Stay tuned for a CALU case study coming up in like a week and a half. I'll be leading that. We'll drop some details, but that'll be super fun. It'll be kind of a mix of like me going through a specific case, breaking out, coming back, talking it over, coming back, talking it over. It'll be a lot of fun. So that's coming up. Stay tuned, and stay tuned for more journal clubs as well. We will see you next time.
Good to see you, Chris.
Good to see you. I love this has turned into like a thing now.